When schools started replacing physical education with wellness programs, most people assumed it was progress. The language changed first. Running became cardiovascular activity. Playing became structured movement sessions. By the time the shift was complete, what children did with their bodies had been fundamentally redefined, and almost no one had questioned why. The change didn't announce itself. There were no public hearings, no widespread debate about whether this was the right direction. It arrived through administrative updates, curriculum revisions, and the quiet adoption of new guidelines that seemed, on the surface, more sophisticated than what came before. Physical education departments were restructured. New certifications were introduced. The word wellness appeared on school schedules, and it sounded modern, informed, like someone had finally figured out the right approach. What made the transition so seamless was how reasonable each individual step appeared. Traditional PE had problems, everyone knew that. Some kids were bullied, some teachers were poorly trained. The old model felt outdated, maybe even harmful in ways people were just beginning to name. So when wellness programs arrived with promises of inclusivity, mental health awareness, and personalized approaches to fitness, resistance seemed not just futile but backward. Questioning it meant you didn't care about children's emotional well-being, or worse, that you wanted to return to some mythologized past that never actually existed. Schools received new equipment, not balls and bats, but heart rate monitors, tracking devices, educational materials about nutrition labels and stress management. The focus shifted inward. Instead of learning to move instinctively, to negotiate space with other bodies, to develop timing and coordination through play, children learned to monitor themselves. They learned to think about movement as something that required constant assessment, optimization, expert guidance. The body became a project, not an instrument. Teachers noticed, but carefully. In private conversations, some mentioned that kids seemed less comfortable with unstructured activity, that when given free time, many didn't know what to do with their bodies anymore, that basic skills, catching, throwing, the kind of movement literacy that used to develop naturally, now required explicit instruction for many students. But these observations stayed informal, anecdotal, the kind of thing you might mention in a staff room but wouldn't put in a report. Because the metrics that mattered had changed, and by those new standards, the programs were working exactly as designed. Most people never noticed this at the time. If you were a parent in those years, you saw the updated curriculum materials, you heard about the school's commitment to student wellness, and it seemed like the kind of forward-thinking approach you wanted for your child. The fact that your kid could recite the components of a balanced plate but couldn't do a somersault, that seemed like an acceptable trade. After all, weren't we supposed to be moving beyond the crude physicality of previous generations? Wasn't this more enlightened? The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in ways that could be traced back to a single policy change, but gradually, as a generation grew up with a fundamentally different relationship to their own physical capacity. Young adults who experienced anxiety around unstructured movement, who needed instructions, plans, programs to feel safe engaging in physical activity, who had learned very thoroughly to think about their bodies as things to be managed rather than trusted. The programs had promised better health outcomes, and perhaps they delivered on certain measurable metrics, but what they produced, more profoundly, was a population that had internalized surveillance of their own movement. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. The infrastructure was in place. Entire industries had developed around the monitoring, the optimization, the endless cycle of assessment and intervention that wellness culture required. Going back wasn't an option, even if anyone had wanted to. The old model of physical education, with all its legitimate flaws, had been so thoroughly discredited that suggesting maybe children should just run around seemed almost irresponsible. The experts had spoken. The research, funded by companies that sold tracking devices and wellness curricula, had confirmed what everyone already believed. This was better. This was science.
But whose health were these programs actually designed to protect? When you looked at what changed and what didn't, a pattern emerged. Children learned extensive vocabulary about nutrition, but often ate the same institutional food they always had. They learned about mental health, but spent more time sitting still than any previous generation. They learned to measure and track and assess, but many lost the simple pleasure of physical competence, that feeling of knowing what your body could do without having to think about it. The shift happened because it served institutional needs, not because it served children. Wellness programs were easier to standardize than traditional PE. They were easier to assess using the kind of metrics administrators needed for reporting. They reduced liability because monitored, controlled movement is safer than the chaotic energy of actual play. They aligned with broader cultural anxieties about children's bodies, giving parents and educators a sense of control in an increasingly uncertain world. And, perhaps most importantly, they created markets. For devices, for curricula, for expert consultations, for all the products and services required to manage what used to happen naturally. This wasn't about a few misguided policies. This was structural. The same logic that replaced physical education with wellness programs was operating across multiple systems simultaneously, all making similar decisions, all justified with similar language about safety and optimization and evidence-based practice. Schools, healthcare, food production, urban planning, each operating according to its own institutional imperatives, each making choices that seemed reasonable in isolation but accumulated into something much larger. The children didn't choose this. They adapted to the environment adults created, the way children always do. They learned what they were taught, they internalized what they practiced, they became what the system needed them to become. Good self-monitors, compliant participants in their own optimization, young people who understood their bodies as problems requiring expert management rather than as sources of capability and joy. That was the outcome the system was designed to produce, whether anyone consciously intended it or not.
What made this possible was the absence of resistance, not because people agreed necessarily, but because the changes came packaged in language that made opposition difficult. Who could argue against wellness, against evidence-based practice, against caring for children's mental health? The framing preempted criticism, made questioning seem reactionary or naive. By the time the full implications became clear, the debate was already over. Parents who felt uneasy, who noticed their children seemed disconnected from their own physical capacity, often blamed themselves. Maybe they hadn't enrolled them in enough programs. Maybe they needed to be more vigilant about screen time, more proactive about structured activities. The possibility that the problem was systemic, that the very framework of wellness culture might be producing the outcomes they were trying to prevent, that thought was almost unthinkable. Because it meant there was no individual solution, no way to simply make better choices within the existing system. Teachers who saw what was happening had even fewer options. The curriculum was set, the metrics were determined by people far removed from actual classrooms. Professional development pushed the same frameworks, the same approaches, the same underlying assumptions about what bodies need and how health is achieved. Suggesting that maybe children should spend less time learning about health and more time just moving, that could mark you as unprofessional, behind the research, possibly even harmful. So, most adapted. They taught what they were told to teach, measured what they were told to measure, and tried not to think too hard about what might be getting lost. The language of wellness provided perfect cover for what was fundamentally a shift in control. By framing everything in terms of health outcomes, institutional decisions could be presented as neutral, scientific, beyond politics or values. But every choice about how children should move, what they should learn about their bodies, what relationship they should develop with physical capacity. Those are deeply political choices. They shape what kind of adults emerge, what kind of society becomes possible. Presenting them as purely medical or pedagogical decisions was itself an exercise of power, one that removed these questions from democratic deliberation.
And that wasn't coincidental. This shift accelerated during the same decades when childhood itself was being fundamentally restructured. When unstructured outdoor play was disappearing, when supervision became constant, when risk of any kind became unacceptable, wellness programs fit perfectly into this larger transformation. They gave adults something to do, a way to feel they were protecting children in an environment where actual physical autonomy was increasingly restricted. The monitoring, the tracking, the endless assessment, it all served to manage the anxiety adults felt about children's bodies in a world that had eliminated most opportunities for those bodies to develop capability through experience. The generation that grew up in this system is now raising children of their own, and many are trying to do things differently. They remember what it felt like to be constantly monitored, to internalize that nothing about their body could be trusted without expert verification. They see their own children struggling with the same disconnection, the same anxiety around physical activity, and they're looking for alternatives. But the infrastructure that produced these outcomes is stronger than ever. The markets are more developed, the professional apparatus more entrenched, the language of wellness even more dominant in every institution they encounter. What would it mean to actually resist this? Not through individual choices, not by simply opting out or finding better programs, but by questioning the entire framework. By asking whether wellness culture, for all its claims about health, might actually be producing exactly the opposite. By wondering what we lost when we decided children's movement needed to be constantly supervised, measured, optimized by adults who themselves had often lost touch with what physical competence feels like. By considering that maybe health isn't something that can be programmed into people through the right curriculum or tracked through the right devices, but emerges from a fundamentally different relationship to embodiment entirely. These questions don't have simple answers. They can't be resolved through better research or improved guidelines because the problem isn't technical. It's about what we believe bodies are for, what childhood should be, what kind of humans we want to raise. Those aren't questions experts can answer on our behalf. They require collective deliberation, actual debate about values and priorities and the kind of society we want to build. But wellness culture short-circuits that conversation by framing everything as a matter of health outcomes, as if there's one correct answer that research will eventually reveal.
The children who grew up in the first wave of wellness programs are adults now. Many struggle with movement in ways their parents didn't. Not because they're less informed. They know far more about exercise science, nutrition, stress management than previous generations. But knowing about health and actually feeling capable in your body are not the same thing. One requires education. The other requires experience. The kind that comes from movement that isn't monitored or assessed. From physical challenges that aren't designed by experts, from the gradual development of trust in what your body can do. That trust is hard to build in a culture that treats bodies as perpetual problems, that tells you from childhood that how you move, what you eat, how you feel all require constant expert intervention, that presents physical capacity as something to be achieved through programs, rather than something that develops naturally when given the chance. The promise was that all this monitoring and optimization would produce healthier people. But what if it produced the opposite? What if the very act of treating bodies as projects requiring constant management made it impossible to develop the kind of easy physical competence that previous generations took for granted? Schools aren't going back to what they did before. The old model of physical education is gone, and much of it deserved to disappear. But what replaced it wasn't inevitable. It was a choice made by people and institutions with specific interests and assumptions. implemented in ways that served those interests regardless of the impact on children. Understanding that means recognizing that current approaches aren't the final word, that the way we've organized children's movement for the past few decades is just one possibility among many, and not necessarily the best one. Somewhere in the gap between rejecting the old model and accepting the new one, other possibilities existed. Ways of thinking about children's physical development that didn't require constant monitoring. Approaches that trusted bodies more and managed them less. Frameworks that understood health as something that emerges from capability and autonomy rather than compliance and optimization. Those possibilities weren't explored, not because they were tried and failed, but because the institutions making decisions had reasons to choose the path they did. Reasons that had very little to do with what children actually needed. And this wasn't the only change. The same logic that transformed physical education was operating across every aspect of how children's bodies were understood and managed, creating a comprehensive system of control that presented itself as care. What happened in schools was just one piece of something much larger, and the full scope of that transformation is only beginning to become visible.